All right, ready for a deep dive?
Let's do it.
Today, we're heading to Italy, to the land of pizza and pasta, but more importantly, red squirrels,
Oh, yeah, some charismatic critters.
definitely. And we're looking at how they're dealing with forests that are kind of like broken up,
Yeah.
not one big forest, but lots of little patches.
Fragmented, yeah. It's a big issue for lots of wildlife.
Exactly. So we've got this scientific paper, and it's all about whether squirrels are actually living in these little woods and how that changes depending on where you are in Italy.
So, does the landscape around those woods make a difference?
Yep. And they looked at two pretty different places. The Apennines, kind of mountainous, with woods here and there, and then the Po Plain, which is flatter, with a mix of farms and forests, especially along the Po River.
Okay, so different starting points for our squirrel friends.
For sure. And get this, they found way more red squirrels in those Apennine woodlands. Makes you wonder why, right?
Definitely. What's going on in the Po Plain that's not so squirrel friendly?
Right. Well, the paper talks about this idea of source sink dynamics,
Hmm.
and the Po Plain is a perfect example. Think of it like this. Those big forests along the river, those are like the squirrel metropolis, the source population.
So, lots of squirrels doing their thing and maybe some striking out to new areas.
Exactly. But then you've got these little woods further away, the sinks. Squirrels can get there, but if something happens to that little group, it's way harder for them to bounce back.
Because they're more isolated, so less chance of new squirrels coming in to help out.
Exactly. It's like trying to keep a tiny village going when you're miles from the nearest town. You need those connections. And speaking of connections, this paper had me geeking out over how far these little guys can actually travel. They usually stick close to home, like a few hundred meters.
Yeah, sensible. Why go far when you've got all the nets you need right there?
Right. But get this. They found that in some cases, red squirrels have traveled up to 64 kilometers, like a squirrel ultramarathon.
Whoa, that's crazy. But it also shows you how vital it is to have those connections between woods. If they can travel that far, we got to make sure they have a way to do it.
Totally. And that's where the Apennines finding gets so cool. Even when the woods were small, there were still squirrels hanging out. And the researchers think it's because of those ecological corridors.
Like those wildlife bridges you see over highways?
Kinda, but more like hedgerows, lines of trees, basically squirrel highways connecting those little woodlot islands.
So it's not just about having big forests, it's about making sure they're linked up.
You got it. But there's another layer to this. The researchers actually compared their findings to a study from the Netherlands.
Okay, interesting. Were the Dutch squirrels also mammothon runners?
Uh-huh. Who knows? But they had a similar amount of forest fragmentation over there, but more squirrels overall. And get this. Those Dutch woods had way more coniferous trees, pines and firs.
Which red squirrels love. I mean, oak is fine, but conifers are like the five-star squirrel resort.
Exactly. So we've got location, size, and now the type of trees all mattering for these red squirrels. Talk about picky tenants.
They know what they want. But seriously, it shows that we can't just look at a single patch of habitat in isolation. It's about the whole picture, the connections, the quality.
Yeah.
It's like planning a whole squirrel city, not just individual squirrel houses.
That's a great way to put it. And it makes you wonder about those Italian squirrels in the Po Plain, living in those isolated woods. What's life like for them?
Well, it's kind of rough out there for those isolated Po Plain squirrels. They're really living on the edge, you know? The study found that only the woods closest to those river forests had squirrels.
Ah, so they need to be close enough to that source population to stay afloat.
Exactly. And it seems like that's been the case for a while. They even talked to local gamekeepers, and those guys said no red squirrels in those more isolated woods for like 40 years.
40 years. That's a long time to be missing from a forest. Like, it really shows how fragmentation can just kind of slowly squeeze a species out of an area.
Yeah, it's a gradual process, but the effects are huge. Those river forests are still crucial, but the squirrels in those smaller woods are basically dependent on new squirrels coming in from the source just to keep their numbers up.
So they're relying on squirrel immigration to keep their tiny nation going.
That's a great way to put it. And because of this reliance on outsiders, the paper called those isolated populations highly susceptible to short-term extinction.
Okay, short-term extinction, that sounds pretty intense. What does that actually mean for a squirrel community?
Basically, they're one bad event away from disappearing entirely. A harsh winter, a disease outbreak, even just bad luck with how many babies are born, any of those could wipe out a small, isolated group.
Ah, so it's not just about having enough squirrels to, make more squirrels. It's about having enough genetic diversity to handle whatever curveballs nature throws at them.
Exactly. And in those isolated woods, they just don't have that backup, which makes those connections, those ecological corridors, even more important.
Yeah, totally. But it makes me wonder, if squirrels can travel pretty far, like we talked about, why haven't those isolated woods been repopulated naturally? You'd think a few adventurous squirrels would strike out on their own and find those spots.
Right, you'd think. The researchers had a couple ideas about that. One is that red squirrels, while they can go the distance, might not be super into exploring. They seem pretty happy in their little wood as long as it's got what they need.
Like, hey, I got my nuts, I got my tree, life is good, I'm not going anywhere.
Exactly. But even if they were explorers, the landscape itself is working against them. In the Pole Plain, those isolated woods are surrounded by farmland. Not much to help a squirrel on the move there.
So, like, trying to walk across a desert versus, like, hopping between islands with little oases in between, one is way easier than the other.
Perfect analogy. So those poor isolated squirrels have got a lot stacked against them. But hey, let's not forget about our Apennine buddies. They seem to be doing much better, right?
Yeah, they've got those hedgerows and tree lines acting like little squirrel bridges between the woods.
Exactly. And that connectivity seems to be key. The researchers still think extinction is possible in those smaller Apennine woods, but the overall picture is way more optimistic.
Makes sense, because if one little population goes kaput, there's a decent chance others will move in and kind of repopulate the area,
Yeah.
like a squirrel safety net.
And that safety net is a perfect example of what's called a metapopulation. Sounds fancy, but it's a really cool idea.
Okay, lay some metapopulation knowledge on me.
A metapopulation is basically a network of connected populations. So instead of thinking of those Apennine squirrels as one big group, picture them as a bunch of smaller groups, all linked together because squirrels can move between them and mix their genes.
So it's like a bunch of little squirrel villages that trade nuts and gossip and genes.
Exactly. And this idea is super important for understanding how species can survive when their habitat is all broken up. It's not just about keeping those isolated pockets, it's about keeping those connections strong so populations can support each other.
Which takes us right back to those ecological corridors. The hedgerows and tree lines are basically the Apennine squirrel's secret weapon.
Right. And it makes you think, how many other species are quietly relying on those same corridors, those seemingly insignificant parts of the landscape?
Yeah, it's easy to focus on the big, beautiful forests, but sometimes it's those little messy bits that are just as important, like the glue holding the whole ecosystem together.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And that's something I really hope people take away from this. Conservation isn't just about protecting those perfect nature areas. It's about appreciating the value of those in-between spaces and the connections they create.
Yeah, it's like we need to shift our thinking, from like islands to archipelagos. It's not just about saving one spot. It's about making sure all those spots are linked up so life can, flow between them. Which makes me wonder, what does all this mean for those of us who aren't out there like planting forests or studying squirrels? What can regular people actually do?
That's a great question. I think awareness is a huge part of it. Even if you don't have a science background, just understanding these challenges like habitat fragmentation is a big step. Once you see it, you start noticing all these little ways to help.
So like if I have a backyard, could I plant some trees or shrubs that would be good for, the local wildlife?
Exactly. Native plants are key.
Mm-hmm.
Or if you're in an apartment, maybe you support organizations that are doing habitat restoration in your area.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Even small things like cutting back on pesticides or keeping your cat indoors, all those things can add up.
It's like once you get that we're all part of this giant web, even those little actions can make that web a bit stronger.
Absolutely. And that's a really hopeful way to think about it, right? We've learned about some of the struggles for those Italian squirrels, but we've also seen how resilient nature can be and how we can all play a part in making things better for wildlife.
Totally. So for anyone listening, here's a thought to chew on. What little things can you do to make your corner of the world a bit more connected, a bit more welcoming for the creatures that share it? Maybe it's planting that tree. Maybe it's supporting a conservation group. Maybe it's just telling your friends about how important habitat is. Every little bit makes a difference.
Yeah, I love that. We can all be part of the solution. One hedgerow, one backyard, one action at a time.